The attic has always been whispering to me. I remember the first time I heard it, a faint scratching that seemed to dance across the ceiling of my bedroom. My uncle dismissed it as mice, but mice don't drag chains or speak in muffled guttural tones, just beyond the range of comprehension. No, whatever lived above me in that sprawling Victorian house was far more deliberate in its movements, and at the center of it all stood that damn trunk, ancient oak, bound with tarnished metal, its surface crawling with symbols that resembled no language I had ever seen. For 20 years, I lived beneath that trunk. 20 years of my uncle's stern warnings to leave it undisturbed. It belonged to my great-grandfather. He would tell me in hushed tones, a collector of rare antiquities who had acquired it during his travels in Eastern Europe. The trunk was sealed for a reason, he'd say, his eyes darting nervously to the ceiling as if something might be listening. The noises always intensified around the full moon. I'd lie awake, my sheets soaked with sweat despite the chill, listening to what sounded like fingernails slowly dragging across wooden floorboards. Sometimes I'd hear a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves, making my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. Last month, my uncle passed away. The house became mine, along with all its secrets. Standing in his study, I discovered a letter addressed to me, yellowed with age, explaining that the responsibility of the trunk now fell to me. He wrote that I could choose to open it if I wished, but strongly advised against it. The key was taped to the back of the letter, a heavy iron thing with teeth like a grimacing mouth. I should have listened. The day I ascended to the attic, my breath fogging in the unusually cold air. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Dust motes swirled in the beam of my flashlight as I approached the trunk, which seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The symbols carved into its surface appeared to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye, rearranging themselves into new configurations that hinted at meanings just beyond my grasp. When I inserted the key, it turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been oiled recently. The lid rose without a sound, revealing nothing but an empty interior lined with faded red velvet. No ancient artifacts, no forbidden texts, nothing but a faint smell of cloves and copper. My disappointment quickly turned to unease as I realized the attic had fallen completely silent. The constant background creaks of the old house had ceased, leaving a vacuum of sound so absolute that my ears rang with it. Then, as I closed the trunk, I noticed a single black feather on the floor that hadn't been there before. That night, everything changed. The noises weren't confined to the attic anymore. Heavy footsteps paced the hallway outside my bedroom. Doors throughout the house opened and closed on their own. Objects disappeared. My watch, my phone, my uncle's letter, only to reappear days later in impossible places. Inside a locked cabinet, buried in a potted plant, floating in the toilet tank. I began to see it in my peripheral vision, a tall, thin shadow that seemed more absence than presence, a slice of utter darkness shaped vaguely like a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Whenever I turned to face it directly, it vanished, leaving behind the lingering sensation of cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. Sleep became impossible. My appetite disappeared. I lost weight rapidly, my clothes hanging from my frame as if they belonged to someone else. The mirror revealed a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with new streaks of gray in my hair. I found myself standing in rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there, staring at walls covered in writing that disappeared when I blinked. I asked my uncle's old friend, a professor of folklore, about the trunk. His face drained of color as I described the symbols. He refused to enter the house, telling me from the safety of his car that such containers were sometimes used as prisons. Not for people, he clarified, seeing my confusion. For things that were never meant to have physical form, things that could only be contained by symbols of binding, not by locks and walls. I returned to find every clock in the house had stopped at 3:33. The temperature had dropped so low that my breath crystallized in front of me. As I stood in the foyer, a sudden silence fell, even deeper than before, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from the ceiling. Something was dripping onto the hardwood floor. Not water, something dark and viscous that smelled of cloves and copper. I looked up to see the ceiling saturated with it, bulging downward like a blister about to burst. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Now I sit in this motel room, miles away, writing this down. But I know distance doesn't matter, because when I look in the mirror, I see it standing behind me, that absence shaped like a man. And when I turn around, I'm alone. But the symbols from the trunk are appearing on my skin, rising like welts, rearranging themselves when I'm not looking. I understand now. The trunk wasn't a prison, it was a door. And I did exactly what my family had managed to avoid for generations. I opened it. The darkness in this house feels different, not the gentle absence of light that comes with nightfall, but something thick and watchful. I noticed it the moment I stepped inside, though I initially dismissed it as the natural discomfort of a new place. The real estate agent had called it a charming Victorian with character. Now 3 nights in, I understand what he meant by character, and wish I'd asked for clarification. The room was a steal for a cash-strapped graduate student. Too good to be true, as they say. Low rent, furnished, close to campus. The landlord mentioned something about high turnover, but cited student transience as the cause. I should have asked more questions. I was unpacking my books when I first noticed the gap in the floorboards beneath the bed. Running my fingers along the edge, I discovered a loose board that came away easily. Inside the small cavity was a leather-bound journal, its spine cracked from use. The name Rebecca was inscribed on the first page in elegant script, dated 3 years ago. My curiosity outweighed any sense of invasion as I began to read. The initial entries were mundane. Complaints about classes, roommates, the creaking pipes. Then on page 17, the tone shifted. Rebecca wrote about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps in the upstairs hallway when her housemates were away, about cold spots that appeared in rooms that had been warm moments before. "There's a woman here," she wrote. "I can feel her watching me through the walls. Yesterday, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in my window. Long dark hair, pale face. When I turned around, no one was there." I closed the journal, a chill running down my spine despite the stuffy August heat. The house settled around me with a groan that sounded almost human. Probably just old pipes, I told myself, sliding the journal back under the floorboard. I would return it to the landlord tomorrow. That night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps overhead, soft, deliberate steps that paced the length of the hallway. My room was on the top floor. There should be nothing above me but the attic, which the landlord assured me was sealed shut decades ago due to structural concerns. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay paralyzed, listening to the steady rhythm overhead. Back and forth, then silence, followed by a soft thump directly above my bed, as if someone had dropped to their knees. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night. In the harsh light of morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a product of reading the journal before bed, stress from moving, from starting a new program. My rational mind searched for explanations. The next evening, I retrieved the journal again. Rebecca's entries grew increasingly frantic. She described the woman in greater detail: Victorian-era dress, hollow eyes, lips moving in silent monologue. She wrote about whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, unintelligible but insistent. About the cold breeze that would sweep through her room at precisely 3:17 every morning, leaving frost patterns on her mirror. As I read this, the air around me cooled noticeably. My breath fogged in front of my face, despite the summer heat. The hairs on my arms stood at attention, and a bead of cold sweat traced a path down my spine. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape passing by my closed door. The footsteps returned that night, more insistent. No longer confined to the area above my room, they now traveled the length of the hallway outside my door. I buried myself beneath the covers, my body trembling uncontrollably as the doorknob slowly turned. When the hinges creaked, I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to face whatever stood in the doorway. The temperature plummeted, my lungs burning with each icy breath. Something brushed against my blanket. 5 distinct points of pressure, like fingertips. I remained that way until dawn broke, afraid to move, to breathe too loudly. When sunlight finally filtered through my window, I threw off the covers to find frost patterns on my hardwood floor, delicate swirls that formed what looked disturbingly like a woman's face. That afternoon, I confronted my landlord. His face drained of color when I mentioned the journal, the woman, the footsteps. He suggested, with forced casualness, that old houses make strange noises. When I pressed further, he admitted that several tenants had complained about similar occurrences, but insisted they were merely the product of overactive imaginations and the house's natural settling. Rebecca's final entry was dated exactly 1 year after her first. The handwriting had deteriorated to frantic scrawls that sometimes tore through the page. She's trying to show me something. In the attic. She keeps pointing upward. I'm going to look tonight. If you're reading this and I never returned, don't go up there. That night, the footsteps didn't pace the hallway. Instead, they moved with purpose toward the small door at the end of the corridor, the sealed attic entrance. I heard scratching, like nails against wood, followed by a long, mournful sigh that seemed to echo through the entire house. My body moved before my mind could stop it. Standing before the attic door, my fingers trembling violently, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratch marks on the inside of the door. Someone had tried to get out. I didn't open it. Instead, I packed my essential belongings and fled to a motel. The next morning, I researched the house's history at the local library. In 1887, a young woman named Eleanor Blackwood had been sealed inside the attic by her husband after discovering his affair. The newspaper claimed she died of consumption. The house passed through many owners after that, with none staying longer than a year. I never returned to retrieve the rest of my things. I transferred to another university in another state. Sometimes, on cold nights, my mirrors still frost over in strange patterns. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting to sleep, I hear the faintest whisper of a woman's voice, asking me why I didn't open the door. The antique mirror arrived on a Tuesday, a wedding gift from my wife's distant relative. From the moment we hung it in our hallway, something felt wrong. Beautiful yet worn, its ornate silver frame dulled by decades of neglect. It commanded attention despite its flaws. That first night, as I passed by, my reflection seemed to linger a fraction of a second too long, like an echo refusing to fade. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the cold unease crawling up my spine suggested otherwise. 3 weeks passed before the first undeniable incident. Walking past the mirror late one evening, I caught a glimpse of movement where there should have been none. A figure stood in the reflection of our empty living room, motionless, watching. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, finding only darkness. When I turned back, the mirror showed only my pale face, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I said nothing to Sarah. She loved that damn mirror, spending long minutes adjusting it each morning, ensuring it hung at the perfect angle. Instead, I began documenting the anomalies. The way it sometimes reflected our kitchen when it should have shown the staircase. The faint, almost imperceptible glow that emanated from its surface at precisely 3:17 a.m. The thin crack that appeared along its bottom edge, though the glass remained smooth to the touch. My research into the mirror's provenance yielded disturbing results. It had passed through multiple families, each experiencing domestic disturbances before hastily selling or gifting it away. The original craftsman, a 19th century artisan named Edmund Wells, had reportedly used silver from melted heirlooms of a family rumored to practice arcane rituals. The more I learned, the more my mouth went dry and my hands trembled when passing that accursed object. Sarah noticed my growing obsession, suggesting I was working too hard. She didn't understand why I'd installed a small camera facing the mirror, nor why I'd begun taking the long way around our house to avoid walking past it. I couldn't explain how the sound of cracking glass would wake me in the dead of night, though the mirror appeared unchanged in the morning light. Or how sometimes, just sometimes, I could swear the reflection showed a room I'd never seen before, walls lined with other mirrors, each containing a different version of our home. The night everything escalated, Sarah was visiting her sister. Alone in the house, I awoke to that familiar sound, glass fracturing, splitting, but never breaking. My tongue felt swollen with fear as I forced myself from bed. The hallway floorboards creaked beneath my weight, each step an exercise in terror. The mirror beckoned with its soft, pulsing glow, illuminating the corridor in sickly blue light. What I saw inside it stole the breath from my lungs. Our hallway, perfectly replicated, but populated with shadowy figures who moved with jerky, unnatural motions. Among them stood a man wearing my face, but not quite right, his features subtly distorted, eyes hollow and hungry. He raised his hand in perfect synchronization with my own trembling gesture. My reflection smiled when I did not. I stumbled backward, my spine pressed against the opposite wall as sweat drenched my shirt. The glass cracked louder now, the sound reverberating through my skull. I wanted to run, to smash that cursed thing to pieces, but fear paralyzed me. My reflection took a step forward while I remained frozen in place. That's when I noticed the difference between our worlds. In his version of our home, the walls were covered in faded markings, symbols etched into the plaster, ancient words forming a ritual, with our mirror at its center. My doppelganger's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. The barrier thins. When morning came, I found myself curled on the hallway floor, joints stiff and mouth parched. The mirror hung innocently above me, showing nothing but my haggard reflection. Sarah returned that afternoon, concerned about my disheveled appearance. I struggled to explain what was happening without sounding deranged, eventually settling for a half-truth about insomnia and strange dreams. That evening, I searched our attic for anything that might explain the mirror's origins. Behind a stack of forgotten boxes, I discovered an envelope addressed to the previous owners. Inside lay a yellowed letter warning that the mirror served as a gateway between worlds, crafted by those who believed multiple realities existed alongside our own. According to the writer, the previous owners had sealed the mirror with blessed silver, weakening its power. The seal, I realized with dawning horror, that we had unwittingly damaged when cleaning and rehanging it. Tonight, as I write this, the cracking sound has grown constant. The mirror's glow illuminates my study like pale moonlight. Sarah insists I see someone about my paranoia, but she hasn't witnessed what I have. How the mirror now shows our doppelgangers going about their lives in a twisted version of our home, watching us, waiting. The barrier between our worlds thins with each passing night. Tomorrow, I'll rehang the mirror with new silver fixtures I've blessed, according to the letter's instructions. If that fails, I'll convince Sarah to return it to a relative, with warnings about its true nature. The reflections grow more substantial each day, and sometimes, when I walk past, hands press against the glass from the other side. They're trying to get through, to replace us in this reality. What terrifies me most isn't the supernatural threat, but the growing suspicion that perhaps we are the reflections, that somewhere a family hung a mirror and inadvertently opened a window into our world, and now they watch us with the same mounting dread that consumes me. Every night, I wake to the sound of cracking glass, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, and wonder which side of the mirror I truly belong on.